Hello. So today I'm going to be reading an excerpt from a book called The Hunters and the Hunted. And this is a segment that has to do with how passenger pigeons were hunted not all that long ago and driven to extinction. So I'm going to get started. And as I'm reading, you'll be able to hopefully see some images of some doves and some passenger pigeons and stuff to kind of hopefully back up the story that's going with. So, as the size of the pioneers' clearings grew and their unrestricted hunting spread, game sometimes grew scarce. Eastwick Evans, who traveled through northern Ohio in 1818, wrote that game cannot always be found. Colonel Richard Henderson, a Kentucky contemporary of Daniel Boone, noted sadly that settlers drove the game out of the county quickly. But in the early and mid 1800s, there were still some species flourishing in such abundance that they seemed of little value, and that was the age of throwaway wildlife. An unforgettable example is the extermination of the wild pigeons that crossed the North American skies in astonishing numbers, bringing gunners the most fantastic wing shooting the world has ever known. Early explorers called these birds turtle doves because of their outward resemblance to European doves, or as they called them, wood doves. We know them as passenger pigeons and find it difficult to imagine how many once lived here. John James Audubon wrote of one flock that darkened the sky and required 3 days to pass overhead. The air was literally filled with pigeons. The light of the noonday sun was obscured as by an eclipse. He recalled that the roar of the wings had a tendency to lull my senses to repose, and the pigeon droppings fell like wet snow. Audubon computed that these birds cruised at 60 miles an hour, and as they exhausted their food supplies, their speed on the wing carried them swiftly to new feeding areas. After visiting a 6-mile wide pigeon roost in Tennessee about 1819, an English traveler wrote that, quote, the birds roost in the high trees which they covered, piled one on the other from the lower to the topmost boughs, which, so laden, are continually bending and falling from their crushing weight. One respected observer, studying the flocks moving up the Mississippi Valley on their spring migration in the 1860s, calculated that they passed at the rate of 120 million pigeons an hour. For 5 hours, the flight continued, perhaps 600 million birds in a fraction of a day. A noted Indian chief named Simon Pokagon studied the pigeons in the final years of their abundance. He visited nesting grounds in Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana between 1840 and 1880. He wrote that the nesting areas were commonly up to 30 miles long and 4 miles wide. And within these areas, every tree was spotted with nests. Moritz Fisher, writing in 1913 in Bird Lore, calculated that such a nesting ground would harbor 57 million adult breeding birds. These concentrations attracted Indians from miles around. They came with their families and stayed on the pigeon nesting grounds for a month or more, feeding on squab and turning fat young pigeons into, quote, squab butter for spreading on other foods. They smoked and dried supplies of the birds to take with them. The pigeons fattened on nuts, acorns, chestnuts, berries, weed seeds, and insects. Beechnuts were a favorite, and as the nuts ripened in the fall, the pigeons came thundering into the big woods for the harvest. Audubon wrote that the sheer weight of the pigeons crowding in to feed broke off trees 2 feet in diameter near the ground, or brought large limbs crashing down, killing many pigeons in the process. Wherever they went, whether nesting, feeding, resting, or moving, the highly social pigeons stayed together. Once the flock had fed, it was off toward the end of the day for its favorite roost, and soon the rookeries became known to the pigeon hunters. Everywhere the birds appeared, they were attacked by people. In the nesting areas where their nests bent the tree limbs, Both nests and squabs were knocked to the ground by the thousands so the nestlings could be sent to market. Pigeons were also killed at their watering places and on their roosts. Audubon often visited a giant roost along the banks of the Green River in central Kentucky, and he described one night's hunt there. 2 hours ahead of sunset, the air around the large open woods was empty. Not a pigeon could be seen, but the people were already waiting. Men and boys from miles around had brought guns, poles for knocking down the pigeons, pine knot torches, sulfur for smoking them out of trees, fire for burning them out, and grain soaked in alcohol as a bait to intoxicate the pigeons, which could then be gathered up by hand. People slid about under the trees in pigeon dung, inches deep. Someone shouted, "Here they come!" And the whispering wings soon roared like a waterfall as pigeons began settling into the treetops in the dusk of evening. Wave after wave arrived, crowding into the branches until they were landing on the backs of other birds and hanging on the branches in clusters like swarming bees. By this time, the pigeon harvesters were hard at work. The birds made such a commotion that the explosion of guns fired into the mass of birds could not be heard except by the gunners themselves as they fired. Long poles reached into the trees and knocked hundreds of pigeons to the ground and to be gathered up in heaps. Others set sulfur pots beneath the trees and moved upwind to wait until the suffocating pigeons began raining to earth. As the pigeons showered about them, men lit fires so they could see to work. The birds seemed indifferent to the tragedy of the roost. As the new day dawned on the banks of the Green River, the surviving birds began leaving the roost, while behind them people gathered up the dead and wounded. Audubon said the pigeons were heaped up, quote, until each had as many as he could possibly dispose of. Any they missed were cleaned up by hogs brought in by farmers to fatten on the remains. One large herd of hogs had been driven nearly 100 miles to reach this bonanza. What did people do with these rich harvests of pigeons? They sold all they could at market. Pigeons were shipped to the East Coast where they were offered at a few cents, sometimes a penny, each. As late as 1840, they were sold on an Indianapolis market for as little as 25 cents a bushel. For 75 years, as long as the birds lasted, they were also taken for trap shoots. One marksman in a 7-hour shoot in Chicago in 1868 hit 605 birds. As many as 500,000 birds a year may have been used by trap shooters because, despite their 16-inch wingspread, the pigeons' swift and darting flight made them difficult targets. The passenger pigeon was a social creature, living in flocks so large that a pigeon hunter could easily bring down several birds with most of his shots. A rifle bullet shot into a mass of pigeons might bring a dozen of them to earth. And a blast from a muzzle-loading shotgun was sometimes known to drop 40 or 50 of them. If they flew low, as they often did, they were simply knocked from the sky with branches. One Pennsylvania pigeon hunter was known to have killed up to 6,000 pigeons in a day using a clap net, whose broad wings snapped shut on as many as 250 birds at a time. Netters baited with grain and acorns. They also decoyed the pigeons with blind stool pigeons that had their eyelids sewn shut to keep them perched. Another method of capturing birds was to set a limber pole into a ridge where the birds passed at low elevation. The hunters attached a rope to the pole and then hid at a distance and kept the pole whipping back and forth as the birds flew over. With this device, they knocked pigeons from the sky by the dozens. Sometimes the pigeon hunter would dig a long trench and scatter grain along the bottom. Then, taking cover in a nearby blind, he would wait until the ditch was crowded with pigeons and then fire down the length of it. Some hunters preferred testing their marksmanship against flying pigeons. One Wisconsin market hunter, famous for his wing shooting, averaged some 1,200 pigeons daily. His one-day record was 1,458 pigeons. Any weapon seemed fair. A.W. Schroeder, who wrote the authoritative book The Passenger Pigeon, Its Natural History and Extinction, tells of the soldiers on Lake Ontario who fired into a flock of pigeons with a cannon loaded with grape shot, killing hundreds. In Wisconsin, the Sparta Herald reported that a merchant sold 3 tons of powder and 16 tons of shot during the 1871 pigeon nesting season. Shooting, concludes Schroeder, became the most destructive of all the pigeon killing methods. Gunners far outnumbered trappers, and as the pigeons grew scarcer, shooters traveled farther and farther to find them. Sometimes special trains carried parties of shooters to the nesting areas. Time and again, says Schroeder, the birds were driven away before their young were even raised. By the best estimates, the market hunters took 10 to 12 million adult breeding birds a year between 1866 and 1876. With the combination of direct killing and the destruction of forests, the end came quickly. Concerned people began forecasting the pigeon's doom. In 1876, a writer in Rod and Gun, an American Sportsman, wrote, quote, "I was speaking with an old pigeoner who had followed the business for 21 years, and his opinion was that the birds were rapidly decreasing. It is high time to do something for their protection." In 1878, remnant flocks in Michigan and Pennsylvania were still large enough to attract the last of the commercial pigeon takers. Between April and September that year, 30 million more pigeons were taken from their nests and shipped to the cities. After that, the birds may still have assembled 1 million strong in a single Michigan location near Grand Traverse. Again, they were attacked, and 20,000 of the last of the great pigeons were shipped to Coney Island, New York, for a trap shooting tournament. Finally, by the 1890s, the last of the passenger pigeons were gone from the wild. People who had seen the pigeons by the hundreds of millions in their youth saw them no more. Passenger pigeons had been so abundant that they were not even considered a game bird until the mid-1800s, when they began to diminish noticeably. By the turn of the century, they were so rare that they were prized possessions in a few zoos, where they lived out their final days in cages. Zookeepers in Cincinnati kept these symbols of the American wilderness alive longer than anyone else. The world's last known passenger pigeon died there in 1914. Her name was Martha. In the zoo grounds today, her little stone house stands as a memorial to her kind, telling the story of the passenger pigeon and of other species that have slipped into the last great darkness. So again, the book that I was reading comes from a text called The Hunters and the Hunted by George Laycock. And this was just the section on the passenger pigeon. Thank you for watching.